Hello everybody and welcome back to a brand new video of the Global Awareness Report. We are going to, as always, start off with the updates from the Russo Ukraine war. And in the Battle of Bakhmut, the Russian forces have captured everything east of the railway that runs through the city. And now the only Ukrainian defenses are in the sort of western parts of the city here. Everything east of the railway has been captured, so Russia, week by week, is slowly but surely advancing through Bakhmut as more of the city has been captured street by street, block by block. It appears that Russia is advancing through Bakhmut at a decent pace for an urban combat. Although how much losses have they taken as a result of this is unknown, although it is probably very high. So this doesn't come for free. This obviously comes at a probably a very hefty price for Russian forces, but they are advancing through the city, and eventually it seems as if Bakhmut will fall, although it is holding on for a lot longer than I expected, as the Russians also advanced on the western outskirts of the city here, sort of in these fields to the northwest of the city itself. They've advanced towards the outskirts of Borodarivka, and they have basically captured this part of the 00506, 00506, I should say. This road right here. This road has been unusable for a long time, although now it appears that the Russians have either they've captured it or they're very close to being captured, or they're very close. They have basically captured it. As a matter of fact, they have basically captured it, but they are encroaching on the western parts of this Bakhmut sector of Kremove, Ivaniske, and they are approaching, and it appears that they are going to try some kind of encirclement, or at least put pressure on the flanks of Bakhmut. That is what it appears that they are trying to do. On the other parts of the front, it's basically been static, almost no updates, very few. There have been engagements, but there hasn't been any real frontline changes, any real significant frontline changes. So the war has slowed down, so to say, in some regards. This has actually happened before. I believe it was before the September offensive when Ukraine took back much of Kharkiv Oblast, almost all of the Oblast, in September. Before that happened, the front was a bit static, if I do recall correctly. So this isn't the first time this happened. There is usually a big offensive, a lot of fighting, a lot of ground being changed, a lot of ground changing and front lines moving, and then over time it slows down until the next big offensive happens. That's sort of what we're seeing with this war. But we are going to now move on to the geopolitical updates, where the chief of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said that Ukraine has a rightful place within the alliance. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg definitely declared Thursday that Ukraine's rightful place in the military alliance and pledged more support for the country on his first visit to Kiev since Russia's invasion just over a year ago. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged Stoltenberg, who has been instrumental in marshalling support from NATO members, to push for even more from them, including warplanes, artillery, and armored equipment. So it appears that once this war has been resolve, whatever the result may be, that Ukraine is obviously going to pursue NATO membership. That makes sense. I mean, that's should be a surprise to no one that they would do that. But the fact that he visited Kiev for the first time, and the fact that he said that they have a rightful place within the alliance obviously goes to show that NATO is still fully on board with Ukraine, and that the area surrounding the capital is safe enough for high-level people within NATO and within the United States. Of course, Joe Biden visited Kiev not too long ago, and now Jens Stoltenberg is visiting Kiev. So this does go to show that the area around Kiev is safe enough for these people to visit. And it is also a very defying move. It sends a message to the Russians that Ukraine is safe enough from Russian forces that we can enter it, and they are acting like Ukraine is already a member of NATO, which basically which is to show the Russians that Ukraine will inevitably join NATO. But we are going to move on to some news about diplomats and expulsion. First of all, we are going to talk about Moldova summoning Russian envoys to expel members of the embassy. The small Eastern European nation of Moldova summoned the Russian ambassador on Wednesday to declare a member of embassy staff persona non grata, prompting Moscow to complain. Government press secretary Daniel Voda told reporters the decision was connected to the actions of the embassy staff towards Moldovan border guards who denied entry to a regional Russian politician at the Chisinau airport this week. Moldova, which applied to join the European Union last year alongside its neighbor in Ukraine, has repeatedly accused Russia of trying to destabilize the country, something Russia denies. So Moldova used to be quite neutral towards Russia. They used to have a pretty good relationship between Russia and the West. They sort of sat in between the two, but now, obviously, since the invasion of Ukraine, and obviously Moldova has always had trouble with Russia, given Transnistria and this history surrounding that. But now they are firmly pro-West, and they have a very pro-Western government. And it probably is the case that any new government that comes into Moldovan power is going to be pro-Western, regardless of what political party. Most political parties in Moldova, I believe, most mainstream ones at least, are pro-Western and pro-Western integration nowadays. But that's not the only news regarding embassies, as Russia has announced the mass expulsion of German diplomats in a tit-for-tat move. The Russian Foreign Ministry said it is expelling a number of German diplomats in what it calls a mirror action to a previous unannounced move by Berlin as relations between the two countries continue to deteriorate. The Russian Ministry on April 22nd said that a reaction to Berlin's hostile actions, the Russian side declared to mirror the expulsion of German diplomats from Russia, as well as to significantly limit the maximum number of employees of German diplomatic missions in our countries. So Germany, unannounced, removed Russian diplomats from the country, and so now Russia is doing the same, removing German diplomats from the country. This is not too surprising, but it does go to show that the deteriorating relations between the West and Russia is not going to slow down anytime soon. And even after the war in Ukraine is over, whenever that may be, I doubt that relations will ever be the same between Russia and the EU or any EU member states. So we are going to move on to Ukraine and Poland, which last week we discussed how Poland forbid the exportation or the importation of Ukrainian grain into Poland, but now they have struck a deal allowing the transit of grain. Polish and Ukrainian officials say convoys of Ukrainian grain transiting Poland for export abroad will be sealed, guarding and monitoring to ensure the produce stops flooding the Polish market and playing havoc with prices. Thursday's announcement comes after 2 days of intensive talks following protests by Polish farmers who said much of the Ukrainian grain was staying in Poland and creating a glut that caused them huge losses. The deal also ends a temporary prohibition issued by Poland Saturday to address the protests on the entry of grain from Ukraine. Hungary and Slovakia, which have also suffered effects by the transit of Ukrainian farm produce, later took similar measures. These moves drew anger of the European Union's executive branch, the European Commission, which manages trade for the 27 member countries. So Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary have all reached deals with Ukraine, allowing the transition of Ukrainian grain through their countries, and they are making sure that the grain arrives in its destination and doesn't stay in these countries, which is increasing the prices, which is messing with the local farmers there. But this drew a bit of the ire from the European Commission, which is supposed to manage this kind of thing, not the individual countries. But Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland all of course do not really get along with the European Union very well. But we are going to move on to even more news out of Europe, where Serbia and Hungary, both of their leaders, attended a military display in Serbia unannouncedly. The populist leaders of Serbia and Hungary observed a Serbian military exercise Saturday, an event that has seen the display of lethal firepower amid the war in Ukraine and tensions in the Balkans. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban arrived in Serbia on a previously unannounced visit. He was greeted by Serbian President Alexander Vučić, who said he was happy to once again welcome a great friend of Serbia. Serbian and Hungarian relations are at the highest level in the history of our countries, Vučić wrote on Instagram. Both leaders have maintained political and economic ties with Russia despite its aggression in Ukraine. The relations with Moscow has been a sore spot with other European nations and with the United States. Although Serbia formally seeks membership in the European Union, Vučić has refused to join international sanctions against Russia or publicly condemn the war in Ukraine. So it appears that Hungary is sort of trying to position themselves to be something of a regional leader in the Balkans. Being friendly with Serbia, a state which does not have good relations with the West, although it does want to join the EU. A state which maintains a neutrality between the West and Russia in a way. It appears that Hungary is wanting to draw closer to Serbia and become sort of a regional leader in the former Yugoslav region and in the Balkans as a whole. But we are going to now move on to more news from Sudan. Previously, we talked about the Sudan crisis, but on Wikipedia, they have a map of forces controlled by a territory controlled by the Rapid Support Forces, which is a paramilitary group that is coming into contact with the National Army of Sudan. And so, according to Wikipedia, this is a rough outline of the territory controlled by the Rapid Support Forces. And this is, of course, not very detailed. This is not entirely accurate. The situation is, pretty fluid. It's changing. These aren't the definitive front lines. This is just a rough idea of what the front lines look like in the current crisis. But Sudan fighting continues despite a ceasefire, and the army has agreed to help evacuate foreigners. Sudan's army said on Saturday it has agreed to help evacuate foreign nationals as sporadic gunfire and airstrikes echo across Khartoum. despite promises by warring sides to cease fire for 3 days after a week of strife that has killed hundreds. The statement, citing Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, came after promises by rival Rapid Support Forces leader Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, to open airports for evacuations. Sounds of fighting continued overnight, but appeared less intense on Saturday morning than on previous days, a Reuters journalist in Khartoum said. Live broadcasts by regional news channels show smoke rising and thud of blasts. So I don't have enough time to go into the reasons why this is happening, but there is what appears to be some kind of civil war. This was an attempt to overthrow the current government of Sudan by the Rapid Support Forces. They tried to overthrow the current government, but they have not managed to secure the capital or major cities within each of the provinces. They have secured a lot in the western part of the country. This is where their main power base appears to be. But they have not secured the capital. They have not secured the eastern parts of the country. The eastern parts of the country are under the firm control of the army, so it appears that a civil war is underway and that this appears to be the outbreak of a new civil war in Sudan. As well, of course, this has spillover effects, and it is this civil war is affecting, of course, all of Sudan's neighbors, including the country of Chad, where 320 Sudanese soldiers crossed into the country on the 20th. A cognition of soldiers crossed into Chad earlier this week and have been disarmed, said Daoudi Yahya Brahim, Chad's defense minister, at a press conference in the capital of N'Djamena on Wednesday. As fighting rages in Sudan's capital between army chief against the chief of the army and the rapid support forces, regional spillover is increasing after fighting erupted on Saturday as both sides vie for power. Chad closing its 1,400 kilometer or 870 mile border with Sudan. So it appears that these countries are going to start closing their borders with Sudan, and that they're going to be stepping up their border security with Sudan, as it's looking increasingly likely that this is not just going to be some failed coup, but that this is going to start a new civil war, and that both sides are going to consolidate power bases in different parts of the country, and that a civil war will start in Sudan. Now we are going to move on to some news out of Asia, East Asia to be specific, as the Philippines and China are to set up more lines of communication to resolve maritime issues. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and his Foreign Secretary met Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang on Saturday in Manila, with Manila and Beijing pledging to work together to resolve their maritime differences in the South China Sea. So this comes after China has accused the Philippines of destabilizing the region, with the Philippines agreeing to set up more American military bases in the country recently. But it appears that the Philippines and China are trying to come into diplomatic talks over this, and that they are agreeing to try and cool down the simmering tensions in the South China Sea, which is good news for the region. But in news that is sort of the opposite of trying to cool off simmering tensions, Taiwan is to buy 400 anti-ship missiles to face the Chinese threat against the island. Taiwan will buy as many as 400 U.S. land launched Harpoon missiles in face of rising threat from China, Bloomberg News reported on Monday, citing a trade group's leader and people familiar with the issue. The Pentagon announced a $1.1 billion contract for 400 of the anti-ship missiles on April 7th, without naming the buyer. Saying production was expected to be completed by March 2029, Bloomberg said Taiwan was the buyer. So according to Bloomberg, Taiwan is buying these 400 anti-ship missiles as the island is arming itself for what many are saying is looking increasingly like an inevitable invasion of the island, although not everybody is saying that an invasion of Taiwan is inevitable, but many are saying that. So as the Philippines tries to cool tensions with China, Taiwan feels threatened enough in order that they need to buy anti-ship missiles, a large quantity of anti-ship missiles from the United States. Moving over to the Korean Peninsula, Russia warns South Korea against arming Ukraine in unfriendly stance, threatens retaliation involving North Korea. So what Russia basically said is that if South Korea were to send weapons to Ukraine, that Russia would be sending weapons to North Korea. Unfortunately, Seoul has taken a rather unfriendly stance, said Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. The start of arms supplies will indirectly mean a certain stage of involvement in this conflict, he added. The remarks also drew the warning of Russian ex-leader Dmitry Medvedev, who served as president between 2008 and 2012. Medvedev said that Russia could reciprocate and send weapons to North Korea, formerly known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I wonder what the residents of this country will say when they see the latest Russian arms with their closest neighbor, our partners from the DPRK, he added, quid pro quo. So there are influential Russian politicians saying that if South Korea were to send weapons to Ukraine, that Russia should send North Korea its weapons as the war in Ukraine continues on. It also has spillover effects in some ways. You could call this a spillover effect from the Ukraine war, even as far as the Korean Peninsula. It just goes to show that when you're living in such a globalized era where what happens in one part of the world does drastically affect another part of the world, and that's partially why I'm doing this series in the first place, is so you can be aware of what's happening around the globe, hence the name Global Awareness Report. But in more news involving South Korea, President Joe Biden has pledged to take steps to deter a nuclear attack on South Korea. At a summit next week with South Korean leader Yoon Suk-yeol, U.S. President Joe Biden will pledge substantial steps to underscore the U.S. commitment to deter a North Korean nuclear attack on South Korea, a senior U.S. official said on Friday. So Joe Biden is saying that they will reinforce the alliance between South Korea and the United States. That's not very surprising, but we are going to try and wrap this up. I believe we only have one news story left to cover, and that comes from the nation of Chile in South America, where they are planning to implement some nationalization policies revolving their lithium deposits, which has spooked investors, and it comes at the dismay of many businesses operating within the country. The Chilean government's newly announced plan to have the state take a majority stake in the lithium industry disconcerts business leaders, though analysis cautions that the proposal appears to try and strike a middle ground between competing interests. I believe that most of Chile's lithium deposits reside in the north of the country, in the so-called lithium triangle. And so obviously lithium is vital for renewable energies and high-tech products. And so Chile is rich in that resource. And so it makes sense why the progressive left-leaning government would try to nationalize that, because many of the corporations mining the lithium are not Chilean corporations, I believe. So the Chilean president wants his country to wants his government to have a stake in this industry, which goes to show just the importance of South America, which is not talked about a whole lot when it comes to geopolitics, but it is very important. There are a lot of vital natural resources for the world to continue to function the way it is that reside within South America. So it is a very important part of the globe that shouldn't be overlooked. So that concludes it for this episode of the Global Awareness Report. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and thank you for watching.